Psalm 1 is like the book's introduction to the next 149 Psalms. We don't know all of the reasons why the Psalter is compiled the way that it is. There are parts of the Psalter where the sequence makes sense, and there are other parts of it where the experts struggle. But the common thought is that Psalm 1 is chosen almost like an introduction to what is next. And the first words of Psalm 1 really set the tone. Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers, but his delight is in the law of the Lord. In other words, what unfolds in the Psalter is an invitation to genuine happiness. Blessed is the man. Blessed means something like truly happy, not simply emotionally happy, not giddy or amused or up, but fulfilled in relationship to God. And the rest of the Psalms, including Psalm 97, train our souls towards real happiness in the broad experience of life, in victory and in defeat, in strengths and in weakness. One of the Psalms that we looked at last summer, Psalm 88, is a particularly grim psalm written in the experience of believing that God is, or fearing that God is absent from the person. And so there is, if you track the thought, somehow a way to experience happiness and blessing even during the darkest of spiritual times. And that is what God, through the Psalter, brings to us. Psalm 97, just read for us, is the Lord's invitation to the nations, to the whole world, to know the joy of his righteous reign. The Lord, and you'll notice the all caps symbolizing the personal name of God, which you might have heard as Jehovah or Yahweh. The personal name of the Lord reigns. Let the earth rejoice. Let the many coastlands be glad. Reigning is what kings and queens do. Yahweh is the great king who reigns everywhere. He reigns over the whole world. And his reign is an invitation to the nations to rejoice, and an invitation to you and to me to rejoice and to be glad. And this invitation, let the earth rejoice, let the many coastlands be glad, is gracious, because left to our own devices, I don't think there's much joy or gladness among the nations. I think that our holiday this weekend bears witness to the fact, as John Ryan was praying, and as we commemorate a holiday in honor of those who've given their lives for our country, it reminds us of the great human cost that is born when there's unrest among the nations. And that story is repeated across history. The coastlands might symbolize the whole world from a particular Hebrew mindset. You know, that God's people mostly lived in the interior of their region. They weren't seafaring people traditionally, so the coastlands might poetically describe the whole big world, but it might certainly include Israel's neighbors, who were often Israel's ancient adversaries. People like the Philistines and the Phoenicians, Philistia, home to giants named Goliath, among others, proverbial antagonists in the story of God's Old Testament people. How could those coastlines be glad? And it just would take a moment of reflection on current events to understand that those coastlines, the coastlines of Philistia and Phoenicia, either are or are very close to what we know as Gaza. How would happiness and gladness come to the coastline today? How would happiness and gladness come to the coastline of Crimea? Closer to home in our angry nation, how could our coastlines be glad? or closer yet, in the interior of your soul, of my soul, of the coastline of our soul, where who we truly are bumps into a reality that we have difficult navigating, how can we be glad? That's what Psalm 97 wants us to think about. It's an invitation to joy. It's an invitation that frankly, I'd like to hear and that the nations need to hear, that God's righteous reign invites the joy of the nations. How? How? Well, first, his reign invites joyful confidence that righteousness prevails. The Lord reigns, let the earth rejoice, let the many coastlands be glad. The first cause of rejoicing is Yahweh's sovereignty, that he reigns. He is king everywhere. He is king where he is known and acknowledged. He is king where he is rejected. He reigns because he is, not because we appoint him to the office of king. He reigns because he is king. He is sovereign because that's who he is. We do not permit him to reign, he reigns. And that is good news for the nations. He is the king who humbles the leaders of superpowers. If you're familiar with the story of Daniel and of Daniel's boss, Nebuchadnezzar, who was the superpower emperor of his day, adversary of God's people, captor of many of them, bringer of them into captivity, who, after a moment of great arrogance, was humbled by the Lord in Daniel chapter 4, and he confessed this. Imagine a superpower leader saying this. My reason returned to me, and I blessed the Most High, and praised and honored him who lives forever. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. All of the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing, and he does according to his will among the host of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth. And none can stay his hand or say to him, what have you done? Imagine that kind of king. A man who was a king with power and influence that we could scarcely imagine said, there is one greater than me. There is one higher than me. And of course, you know where you can find the kingdom of Babylon today. In a museum. But God reigns. And that's good news. Psalm 97 focuses us on a specific aspect of God's sovereignty. It's good news that the Most High King's rule is marked by justice. The conflicts that happen on the coastlands, symbolically or actually, are always cast in us versus them, right? When you read the news, and you read the news from a conflict, it's always us versus them. And there's a posturing for the moral high ground. Who is in the right in these conflicts? And we've seen it in the news this week. But here's one way that the debate is never postured. It's always postured us versus them. It's never positioned him versus us. But the psalmist says that one day the conflicts of the world are going to be resolved not in us versus them, but when Yahweh in his righteousness exerts the finality of his rule. Because the throne in heaven's courtroom rests on a foundation of righteousness and justice. Righteousness, what is ethically right, completely truthful. Justice, complete impartial judgment. Yahweh, the sovereign king, who is righteous and just, is also personal and present. That's the import of the imagery of verses 2, 3, 4, and 5. They capture images from times in the Old Testament when Yahweh showed up personally. During the Exodus, at Mount Sinai. Clouds and thick darkness are all around him. Righteousness and justice are the foundations of his throne. Fire goes before him and burns up his adversaries all around. His lightnings light up the world. The earth sees and trembles. The mountains melt like wax before the Lord of all the earth. Yahweh is not an impersonal force. He is not an impersonal force who is righteous and just. He is a person who is personally present, who is righteous and just. And what this means is that every instance of unrighteousness and injustice is personally offensive to him, which means that he personally cares about it. The only side that he takes with regard to righteousness and justice is whose side? His side. As people, we've mostly lost the sense of this. Rightness and wrongness are not the functions of personal choice or superior firepower. Great and small may never appear in the courts of our day. Human courts may miscarry justice, but great and small will appear before the righteous and just throne of the personal God, who will bring all to account. And the psalmist says, and here's the remarkable thing, the psalmist says, that's actually good news. That's good news because if you lack the influence, or if you've been victimized, or if you're just a regular person living under the reign of a Nebuchadnezzar, and you wonder, who will take my cause? Yahweh will take your cause. Not because you're right, but because he's right. He is personally trustable to take account of all unrighteousness. That's good news and also sobering news. And then the sobering news leads to good news. That his righteous presence actually embarrasses idolatry. Verse 6, second point, might sound familiar. The heavens proclaim his righteousness, and all the peoples see his glory. And it might ring a bell that sounds a little bit like Psalm 19 in verse 1, where we read, and this is frequently a call to worship, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky proclaims his handiwork. We love Psalm 19 because it reminds us that God reveals truth about himself generally in nature. The theologians call this general revelation, that you could, as an observant human, look at the world in which you live and ponder something in nature, whether it is a starlit sky or a squid or a squash, depending on what you love in nature, that you could look at something in the natural world and it would prompt you to ask the question, where does this come from? Where does this aurora borealis come from? And a physicist could explain it to you, but you could say, yeah, I understand the physics a little bit that you've explained to me, but where did that come from? What's behind it all? Psalm 19 asks the general question that should prompt you to go on an inquiry to figure out where it came from. Psalm 97 verse 6 is different, helpfully. Heaven's proclamation of Yahweh's righteousness takes us beyond the question of, is there a God? And into the question of, how can I know that God? The heavens in view here in Psalm 97 are not the stars and the planets and the comets. The heavens in view are the personal inhabitants of the spiritual realm. The angels, we might call them. And they proclaim Yahweh's righteousness. Yahweh's righteousness, this personal attribute that he is just and true and utterly fair and consistent and glorious and holy. God's glory describing his personal presence in the Old Testament, often marked by a cloud. For instance, in Exodus 40, then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple. Glory means weighty in the way that we might talk about something substantial. And when the word glory is applied to a person, it means that they're dignified, that they're revealed, that they are substantial. Yahweh is ultimately that. He is that to the maximum. He is superlatively substantial, dignified, eternally honorable. And his magnificent presence puts to shame all of the rivals of our worship. All worshipers of images are put to shame who make their boast in worthless idols. I was thinking about this a little bit. It's probably unlikely to go on in life and acquire wisdom without at some point backing the wrong horse. I mean, maybe an actual horse, but in thinking of it more metaphorically, the mentor that you selected who forgot to mentor you, or the political campaign that you invested in that came in second, or the lover that you thought would change everything. Idolatry is our hearts backing the wrong horse. That's what idolatry is. And whether it's giving your heart to a formal idol of another religion, or simply making the most weighty, significant, worthy object of your affection something other than God, when God shows up in his glory, he embarrasses the idols. He shows us that we've backed the wrong horse. It's sobering when that happens. But the sobering dead end of idolatry points to good news. Worship him, all you gods. Who are those small g gods? Well, in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, that word God is translated angels. Worship him, all you angels. And it seems very likely that the New Testament writer who wrote the book that we call Hebrews, in which the magnificence of Jesus is unfolded for the people of God, so that the people of God will press on in their faith to follow after Jesus under the pressures of their day. It's very possible that the New Testament writer, knowing of the Greek Old Testament, wrote in Hebrews 1 verse 6, when he brings the firstborn into the world, he says, let all God's angels worship him. Which reminds us, loved ones, that there really was a moment in the night sky over Bethlehem when angels serenaded a young couple and a newborn infant, proclaiming the righteousness of God. The angels who greeted the shepherds announced to the shepherds that this was good news for the nations. Psalm 97 being lived out on a hillside outside of Jerusalem. Fear not, for behold, I bring you good news of great joy that will be for all the people. For unto you is born in this day in the city of David a Savior, who is Christ the Lord. Psalm 97 becomes a fact of history when God, whose unseeable personhood, marked by a cloud in the Old Testament, entered history seeable in the incarnate Son for the purpose of bringing joy to all the people. The Son, the eternally existent object of angelic worship, taking to himself a true human nature, incarnate in Mary, even in the womb moment, embarrassing the deadness of idolatry around him, so that on that on that night that we call Christmas Eve, when the angels are singing and the shepherds are gathering and the baby is crying, the cry of the baby embarrasses idolatry and says to the whole world, you've backed the wrong horse. But there's good news. I've come to save you from that. The first cry that Jesus takes is a victory cry for his people and a gasp of defeat for idolatry. All the great and low and the powerful and the powerless who will one day stand before the throne of righteousness and justice where God takes his own side can dare to see that moment as joyful because the infant grows into a man and the man goes to a cross. And on the cross he experiences the righteous consequence of idolatry born for us. That's good news for the coastlands. That's how the coastlands can rejoice. We know that the Lord came the first time, and we know how he will come the next time. The rest of the psalm, I think, is about life in the main time. For those who love him, his preserving power invests joy amidst opposition. Verses 8 and 9 are intriguing. God's people hear of God's embarrassing of the idols, and they're glad, they rejoice. I've pondered what to make of that. I think that it's not so much gloating, because gloating wouldn't fit. If you are someone who has come to know the Savior, then you've come to know the one who's died for your sins. And you've come to know that you love God because he loved you first. So it's not so much gloating as much as I think it's the rejoicing of hearts that want God's best for their neighbors. I think it's the joy, you might say, the joy of mission. Zion hears and is glad, and the daughters of Judah rejoice because of your judgments, O Lord. For you, O Lord, are most high over all the earth. You are exalted far above all gods. It's joyful to the people of God when persons who haven't worshiped God become worshipers of God. When you see the power of God work in the hearts of other people. Which then leads to transformation. That's what verse 10 is about. O you who love the Lord, hate evil. He preserves the lives of his saints. Loving the Most High God will invite opposition, because loving God means loving what he loves and learning to hate what he hates. What does the Lord hate? Well, it seems a wise question to ponder, and Proverbs 6 helps us by giving us a list. The list isn't exhaustive, but beginning in verse 16, there are 6 things that the Lord hates, 7 that are an abomination to him. Haughty, in other words, high in one's own estimation, haughty eyes, a lying tongue, and hands that shed innocent blood. A heart that devises wicked plans, feet that make haste to run to evil, a false witness that breathes out lies, and one who sows discord among brothers. And if we love what the Lord loves and we find ourselves among those of haughty eyes, looking down on others, and if we don't participate in that, we'll find ourselves on the outside. If we love the truth and don't participate in the obfuscation of truth, then we'll find ourselves on the outside. If we find ourselves working to preserve innocent blood, in all of the ways that that can happen, we'll find ourselves on the outside of a culture that values life very cheaply. And as our country becomes more and more pagan, We'll need to find courage to love what the Lord loves because we love the Lord. Verse 10 gives us courage in that direction. He preserves the lives of his saints. He delivers them from the hand of the wicked. Now, if you're a pessimist by nature, you might hear all of this and say, yeah, it's going to be a rough ride. And you might get a little Eeyore-ish and a little bit, I thought it was a holiday weekend, Dave. Bringing me down. It's what I do. What you really need is a big dose of verse 11. God's preserving power amidst opposition is not contrary to joy. Light is sown for the righteous, and joy for the upright in heart. Now, this verse I think people think is the toughest verse in the psalm, and I'm not here to say it isn't. John Calvin, in his commentary on the psalm, says essentially this is the toughest verse in the psalm, and particularly they don't know what to make of the word sown. What does it mean for sown? And Calvin tries a couple different things. I know you're really keen about what Calvin thinks about this, so I'll tell you. He tries a couple of things, and then he's like, well, maybe it's best just to think about it like actual sowing, like what a farmer does. I mean, how would it work that way? And I mean, Calvin doesn't need me to approve his exegesis, but I think that's where it makes the most sense. Because, if you sow something, you're planting it in the present to benefit from it in the future. I mean, don't tell the neighborhood rabbits, but we've got some tomato plants sown in our yard. They'll figure it out soon enough, but they're currently an investment made in the present for the future nutrition of the rabbits, probably. But when you sow a seed, there comes a time when a shoot comes up. And you're like, oh, here it comes. And then the whole plant. And then the fruit of the plant. You come in to the joy of what is sowing. I think that's what the psalmist is saying. That as you persevere through what is hard, the Lord is sowing joy for the future. And you will come into the joy of the future at exactly the right time. Light is sown for the righteous, and joy is sown for the upright in heart. The Lord sows light and joy for those who love him. We come into this joy over time. What this means, among other things, is that in the Lord you have a future, and the future is good. In the Lord you have a future, and the future is good. He brings you, and he brings the righteous who dwell among the coastlines into light and joy. The certainty of our hope is this, that he came first via the cradle and the cross, and next he comes in the clouds. And we will come into joy. Rejoice in the Lord, O you righteous, and give thanks to his holy name.